The social hall in Chicago was buzzing with the kind of loud, happy noise that only happens when a lot of people get together to relax. It was a chilly evening in 1955, but inside the room, the air was warm and thick. Smoke from cigars and cigarettes hung like a gray cloud near the ceiling, and the smell of stale beer mixed with the sharp scent of polished wood. It was a tough crowd. These weren't fancy people in tuxedos, they were working men. They were truck drivers, factory workers, and guys who played music in bars until their fingers bled. They had seen it all, or at least they thought they had. They were loud, laughing at jokes that weren't very polite, and slapping each other on the back so hard it sounded like gunshots. In the corner of the room, there was a big black piano. It looked like a giant sleeping beast. Usually, only the older, well-known musicians dared to touch it. But on this night, a small figure walked out of the shadows and toward the instrument. It was a young boy. He looked barely 10 years old. He was wearing a stiff suit that was clearly bought for him to grow into, the sleeves a little too long and the pants bunching up at his shoes. He had messy hair and a face that looked too young to be in a place like this. As the boy sat down on the high bench, his feet didn't even touch the floor. He had to stretch his legs just to keep his balance. When he reached for the keys, his hands looked so tiny compared to the ivory and ebony notes. A few men at the bar noticed him, but they didn't stop talking. They just nudged each other and laughed. "Hey, look at that," one big guy with a mustache shouted over the noise. "Did someone bring their kid? Is he gonna play chopsticks for us?" The rest of the bar roared with laughter. They thought it was a joke. They thought the boy was the son of one of the band members, maybe sent up there to be cute for a minute. They went back to their drinks and their stories, completely ignoring the small boy sitting quietly at the big piano. The boy didn't look scared. In fact, he didn't really look at the crowd at all. He just stared at the keys for a moment, taking a deep breath. He looked serious, much more serious than any 10-year-old should look. He flexed his fingers, shaking his hands loose like a boxer getting ready for a fight. The noise in the room was deafening. Glasses were clinking, chairs were scraping against the wooden floor, and men were shouting about baseball and work. Then, the boy lowered his hands. He didn't hit the keys softly. He didn't play a gentle note to see if the microphone was on. He slammed his hands down with a sudden, sharp explosion of sound. It wasn't a childish tune. It wasn't chopsticks. It was a loud, fast, complicated chord that seemed to slice right through the smoke and the noise. It was so powerful that the bartender dropped a glass he was drying, shattering it on the floor. The boy didn't stop there. His fingers started to fly across the keyboard. He was playing a style of music that was fast and angry and beautiful all at the same time. It was jazz, but it was something new, something wild. The speed of his hands was a blur. It was impossible. How could someone so small make such a huge sound? The rhythm was driving, like a runaway train, bouncing off the walls. At the tables near the front, the conversation started to die down. A few guys stopped drinking and turned their heads toward the corner. They weren't laughing anymore. They looked confused. They saw the small boy hunched over the keys, sweat already forming on his forehead, and they heard the sound of a master musician coming out of him. It didn't make sense. Their brains couldn't connect what they were seeing with what they were hearing. The boy's left hand was playing a heavy, thumping bass line, while his right hand was dancing up and down the high notes like a spark from a fire. He looked like he was fighting the piano, struggling to tame it, but he was winning. The music poured out of him, filling every inch of the smoky hall. It was aggressive. It demanded attention. It wasn't background music anymore, it was the most important thing in the world. The laughter at the bar had completely stopped. The men who were joking about the kid a minute ago were now frozen, their drinks halfway to their lips. They were looking at the small boy with wide eyes. The big guy with the mustache opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. The sound was just too big, too impressive to ignore. The boy kept playing, faster and faster, his small body swaying back and forth with the rhythm. He wasn't a kid playing a game anymore. He was a giant, and the room was shrinking around him. The silence that was falling over the crowd wasn't quiet, it was a heavy, shocked silence, the kind you get when people witness something they know they will never forget. The music had grabbed them by the collar and forced them to listen, and nobody dared to look away. The shock of that first loud chord didn't just fade away, it seemed to hang in the air like electricity. For a few seconds, the only movement in the whole room was the boy's hands. They were moving so fast that they looked like a blur of motion, a ghostly dance over the black and white keys. The men in the front row, who had been leaning back in their chairs with bored looks on their faces, were now sitting up straight. You could actually see the change in their posture. Their shoulders went back, their chins came up, and their eyes locked onto the stage. The music wasn't simple. It wasn't the kind of tune you hum in the shower. It was complicated. The boy was playing chords that sounded like they were arguing with each other, then making up, then running away together. It was a chaotic, beautiful storm of sound. Usually, when a child plays an instrument, you expect it to sound a bit rough. You expect mistakes. But this was different. Every note was exactly where it was supposed to be. The timing was perfect, sharp as a razor. A man in a grey fedora, who had been in the middle of telling a loud story about a horse race, realized he had stopped talking. He looked down at his hands, as if surprised he wasn't waving them around anymore. He looked back at the stage, his face scrunching up in confusion. He turned to the friend sitting next to him and asked, "Who is that kid?" The friend just shook his head slowly. He didn't know. Nobody knew. They just stared. The boy didn't smile. He didn't look out at the crowd to see if they liked it. He looked like he was in a trance. His head was down, his messy hair falling over his eyes, and his body was swaying side to side. He was fighting the music, trying to keep up with the storm inside his own head. His small fingers were stretching to reach notes that were far apart, and yet, he never missed a beat. He was using the pedals with his feet, kicking them with a rhythm that made the floorboards vibrate. As the song went on, the noise from the back of the room started to change. It wasn't just silence anymore. It was a feeling. The men standing near the bar stopped clinking their glasses. The guy sweeping the floor leaned on his broom and forgot to sweep. The air in the room felt heavy, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. What really caught everyone off guard was the emotion in the playing. It wasn't just noise, it had feeling. It sounded sad and happy at the same time. It sounded like a story that didn't need words. It was the kind of music that digs into your chest and pulls at something you didn't know was there. These were tough men, men who worked hard jobs and didn't show much emotion. But hearing this, they couldn't help but feel something. A gruff-looking man with a thick beard and tattoos on his arms leaned against a pillar near the stage. He had his arms crossed tightly over his chest, looking like he wanted to hate it. But as the boy hit a run of high, sparkling notes that cascaded down the keyboard like a waterfall, the man's eyebrows shot up. His arms uncrossed. He took a step closer to the stage. He wasn't just hearing a kid, he was hearing a genius. It was confusing. How could someone so small carry so much weight in his music? The boy suddenly changed the rhythm. He slowed it down, then sped it up twice as fast, teasing the audience. He played a melody that was familiar, an old jazz standard, but he twisted it. He turned it upside down and inside out. He made it sound new. He made it sound dangerous. The piano was groaning under the abuse, but the sound was pure gold. People in the crowd started exchanging glances. You could see the question on all their faces, is this real? It felt like a magic trick, but there was no trick. It was just 10 fingers and 88 keys. The difficulty of what the boy was doing was not lost on the musicians in the room. The men who played guitar or trumpet knew how hard music was. They knew you had to practice for years to get good, and this kid was playing better than guys who had been playing for 40 years. One older gentleman, a piano player himself with gray hair and thick glasses, walked right up to the edge of the stage. He took off his glasses and cleaned them on his shirt, then put them back on, squinting to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. He watched the boy's left hand. It was jumping across the keys, doing a complicated pattern that would have made most adults' hands cramp up. The old man shook his head in disbelief. A nervous smile appeared on his face, a mix of awe and jealousy. He knew he would never be able to play like that. The boy's face was glistening with sweat now. The stage lights were hot, and the effort he was putting in was immense. He looked like he was running a marathon while sitting down. His breath was coming in short gasps, but he didn't stop. He didn't falter. He was completely lost in the music. The world outside that piano didn't exist for him. There was no smoke, no noise, no crowd. There was just the rhythm and the keys. The music began to get softer. The boy was gently caressing the keys now, playing a delicate, quiet melody that required the audience to lean in to hear. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerator behind the bar. You could hear people breathing. This was the moment the mood shifted completely. The crowd wasn't just curious anymore, they were mesmerized. The aggressive beginning had grabbed their attention, but this soft, beautiful part was holding their hearts. The contrast was startling. 1 minute, the boy was a beast, banging out thunderous chords. The next minute, he was as gentle as a whisper. It showed a level of control that was frightening. It wasn't just showing off, it was art. It was the kind of maturity you expect from an old man who has lived a hard life, not a kid who probably still had homework to do when he got home. The laughter and the rough jokes from the start of the night felt like they happened years ago. The atmosphere in the hall had completely transformed. The air felt charged. It felt like history was being made in that dusty, smoky room, even though nobody knew it at the time. They just knew they couldn't look away. The boy at the piano had them in the palm of his hand, and he hadn't even said a single word. The room was no longer just a noisy bar, it had turned into something else entirely. As the boy's fingers moved from the loud, crashing notes into a softer, drifting melody, the atmosphere seemed to change like the weather shifting before a storm. The heavy smoke that hung near the ceiling didn't look like a gray cloud anymore, it looked like a thick blanket that was suffocating the noise. The silence that started near the front of the room began to move backward, row by row, like a wave rolling onto a beach. It wasn't the polite kind of silence you hear in a library or a church, it was a heavy, tense silence. It was the kind of quiet that happens when everyone in the room realizes they are witnessing something special, something that doesn't happen every day. The men in the back, who were still shouting over each other just a few minutes ago, suddenly realized that the people in front of them weren't listening. They turned around to see what was happening, and when they saw the looks on the faces of the men near the stage, they stopped talking too. One by one, they turned toward the piano. The guy who had been telling the loud joke was now standing with his mouth half open, the punchline dying on his lips. The group playing cards in the corner dropped their hands. The cards were forgotten on the table. Even the bartender, a big man who was usually too busy wiping glasses to care about the music, stopped moving. He held a rag in one hand and a glass in the other, frozen like a statue, his eyes fixed on the small boy in the oversized suit. The music the boy was playing now was different. It was delicate and heartbreaking. He was playing a melody that seemed to float in the air, sad and lonely. It was strange to hear such deep, adult feelings coming from a child. It was like he was telling a story about a life he hadn't even lived yet. He played about pain, and about love, and about being tired, but in a beautiful way. The contrast was shocking. Just moments ago, these men were rough and loud. They were thinking about their jobs, their money, and their problems. They were acting tough, showing no emotion. But now, as the music washed over them, the toughness melted away. They were just human beings listening to something that touched their souls. You could see their expressions change. The hard lines in their faces softened. Their eyes narrowed. Some of them tilted their heads to the side, trying to catch every single note. It was impossible not to look at the boy's hands. They were so small, pale, and fragile against the dark, heavy wood of the piano. They moved with a grace that didn't seem real. It was like watching a bird fly or a fish swim. It didn't look like effort. It looked like magic. Every time he lifted a finger, it was in the exact right place. He wasn't thinking about it, he was feeling it. The connection between his brain and his hands was invisible, lightning fast. The sound was so clear and pure that it cut through the smell of beer and smoke. For a moment, the dirty, dimly lit hall didn't feel like a bar at all. It felt like a concert hall in a big city. The dust on the floor didn't matter. The flickering lights didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the sound spinning out of that piano. A man near the front, wearing a worn-out leather jacket, slowly took a cigarette out of his mouth. He didn't smoke it. He just held it between his fingers, forgetting to light it. He was staring at the boy with a look of total confusion. He looked down at his own rough, calloused hands that had spent years fixing heavy machinery, and then looked back at the boy's smooth, delicate hands. It didn't make sense to him how so much power could come from someone so small. He shook his head slowly, a tiny smile forming on his lips, a sign of respect. The boy still hadn't looked up. He was locked in his own world. His eyes were closed, his face tilted slightly upward. He was swaying a little, not to the beat, but to the feeling of the music. He wasn't performing for the crowd anymore. He wasn't trying to impress them. He was just letting the music flow through him, like water through a pipe. He was an open channel, and the music was using him to get out into the world. As the melody grew sadder and more complicated, you could hear a few people in the room taking deep breaths. It was an emotional experience. Music has a way of getting past your defenses. You can put up walls to stop people from hurting you, but music finds the cracks. It goes right in. These were men who probably hadn't cried in years. They didn't cry now, but you could see the moisture in their eyes. They were blinking faster, looking away, trying to stay in control. The quiet in the room was absolute now. The only sounds were the ticking of a clock on the wall and the music coming from the piano. No one shifted in their seats. No one coughed. No one went to the bar to get another drink. It was like they were afraid that if they made a sound, the spell would break. They were afraid that if they moved, the boy would stop, and the magic would disappear. It was a strange sight to see a room full of grown men, powerful and strong, held hostage by a 10-year-old kid. But that is exactly what was happening. The boy had all the power now. He had taken control of the room without saying a word, without making a threat. He did it just by being incredibly good at what he did. It was a reminder that talent doesn't care about age. It doesn't care about size. It doesn't care if you are a CEO or a janitor. When true genius appears, everyone stops and listens. The boy's hand slowed down even more. He was playing just a few notes now, letting them ring out into the silence. Each note hung in the air for a long time, echoing off the walls. The tension in the room was stretched tight, like a rubber band ready to snap. Everyone was waiting, holding their breath, wondering where he would take them next. He had them on the edge of their seats, literally and figuratively. They weren't just watching a show anymore, they were on a journey, and the boy was the only one who knew the way. Even the musicians in the room, the ones who played instruments for a living, were humbled. They knew how hard it was to play that quietly, to keep the tone so perfect. They knew that one slip, one wrong finger, would ruin the moment. But there were no slips. There were no wrong fingers. There was only perfection. It was the kind of performance that makes other musicians jealous, but also makes them realize that they are witnessing something greater than themselves. The boy shifted his weight on the bench. He lifted his hands high above the keyboard, pausing for just a fraction of a second. The room seemed to hold its breath in that pause. It felt like time had stopped. In that split second, everyone knew that the quiet, sad part was over. The energy was building up again, ready to explode. The grown men leaned forward, their muscles tense, waiting for the storm. They were hooked. They were captivated. And they weren't going anywhere until the very last note was played. The silence broke, not with a sound, but with a sudden rush of movement from the boy's hands. The quiet, sad melody was gone in a flash. The boy slammed his fingers back onto the keys with a force that seemed too strong for his skinny arms. The music exploded. It was loud, fast, and incredibly complicated. He wasn't just playing notes, he was throwing them at the audience. He was attacking the piano. The tempo was dizzying. It was so fast that the individual notes blurred together into a single, driving sound. It sounded like a train speeding down a track, or heavy rain pounding on a tin roof. The rhythm was relentless. It didn't give the listeners a chance to rest. It grabbed them by the throat and didn't let go. The men in the room, who were already leaning forward, now found themselves physically unable to move. They were frozen. It wasn't just because they were interested, it was because their brains were struggling to process what they were seeing and hearing. It was like watching a car accident in slow motion, or a high-wire act where one wrong move means disaster. They were witnessing something that seemed technically impossible. A man standing near the back, a big guy who looked like he spent his days lifting heavy boxes, had his arms crossed tight over his chest. As the music got faster, his jaw slowly dropped open. He tried to close it, but it just fell open again. He looked at the boy's left hand, which was jumping up and down the lower half of the keyboard in a pattern that was so complex it seemed like math. Then he looked at the right hand, which was dancing on the high keys like lightning. The man shook his head in disbelief. He knew, just by looking, that his own hands couldn't move that fast if his life depended on it. The boy's face was a mask of pure concentration. He wasn't smiling anymore. He looked intense, almost angry. Sweat was dripping down his nose and falling onto the keys. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't blink. He was staring straight ahead, looking through the piano, seeing something that nobody else could see. He was in a zone that only great athletes and artists get to. He wasn't thinking about his fingers. He wasn't thinking about the song. The music was just pouring out of him, like water from a broken dam. The sound filled every corner of the hall. It vibrated in the floorboards. It vibrated in the tables. It rattled the change in the men's pockets. It was a physical force. You could feel the beat in your chest. It made your heart want to beat in time with it. The atmosphere in the room had completely changed from just a few minutes ago. The toughness, the roughness, the cynicism, it was all gone. These grown men, who were used to being the strong ones, the ones in control, were now helpless. They were being dominated by a 10-year-old kid. But it wasn't a bad feeling. It was awe. It was the feeling you get when you stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon or look up at the stars. You realize how small you are. Near the stage, an older man with gray hair and a wrinkled face sat perfectly still. He looked like he might have been a musician in his day. He watched the boy's feet working the pedals. He watched the way the boy's body swayed, how he used his whole weight to get the sound out of the instrument. The older man's eyes were wet. He wasn't crying, but there were tears pooling in the corners of his eyes. He wasn't looking at the boy as a cute kid anymore. He was looking at him as a master. He looked like he was watching a ghost, or a miracle. He knew that this kind of talent didn't come from practicing hard. It was a gift. It was something you are born with. The music kept getting harder. The boy played chords that were strange and dissonant, notes that clashed together, but then he resolved them into something beautiful. He was taking risks. A normal player would play it safe, stick to the notes that sound good. But this kid was experimenting. He was pushing the boundaries right there on the stage. And every time he took a risk, he nailed it. The tension in the room was unbearable. It felt like the air was being sucked out of the room. Nobody breathed. Nobody swallowed. It felt like if anyone made a noise, the whole magical structure would collapse. The men were trapped in the moment. They had forgotten who they were. They had forgotten where they were. They had forgotten about their drinks, their jobs, their fights, and their bills. There was only the music. A young guy, maybe 20 years old, was standing by the door with a tray of empty glasses. He had been ready to take them to the kitchen, but he had stopped dead in his tracks. His mouth was open, his eyes wide. He looked terrified, like he was seeing a supernatural event. He looked down at the tray in his hands, then back at the boy, as if checking to make sure the real world was still there. The boy was playing so fast now that his hands were almost a blur. It looked like a magic trick. You kept waiting for him to mess up. You kept waiting for his fingers to get tangled, for him to hit a wrong note, for him to get tired. But he didn't. He played on and on, faster and louder, building the energy up and up. It was exhausting just to watch him. He was putting everything he had into it. It was raw, unfiltered emotion, it was joy, it was anger, it was pain, all mixed together and blasted out through the piano. The men in the crowd were feeling things they hadn't felt in years. The music was unlocking memories. It was making them think about old dreams, old loves, old regrets. The music was universal. It didn't need words to speak to them. It spoke directly to their hearts. It was a language that everyone understood. The boy's foot slammed down on the sustain pedal, holding a massive, low chord that shook the room. He leaned forward, his face inches from the keys, and played a series of high, sharp notes that cut through the bass like a knife. It was dramatic. It was theatrical. It was pure showmanship, but it didn't feel fake. It felt necessary. He was reaching the climax. Everyone could feel it. The music was rising like a tidal wave. The boy was moving his whole body now, his head bobbing, his shoulders shaking. He was giving everything he had left. It looked like he was fighting a battle with the piano, and he was winning. The grown men watched with a mix of fear and wonder. They were witnessing a level of excellence that most people never see in their entire lives. They knew that they would tell this story to their grandchildren one day. "I was there," they would say. "I saw him when he was just a kid." They were realizing that history was being made right in front of their eyes. The boy's hands came down for one final, crashing run. He moved from the bottom of the keyboard all the way to the top, hitting every note in between in a fraction of a second. The sound was a roar. It filled the air, drowning out the world. And then, suddenly, his hands stopped. He didn't play a soft ending note. He didn't fade out. He just stopped. The music cut off instantly. He pulled his hands off the keys and held them in the air, his fingers curled, his chest heaving. The room went silent. It was the deepest, heaviest silence of the night. The sound of the piano seemed to echo in their ears even after it stopped. The men sat frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to take their eyes off the small boy sitting at the big, black piano. It was like the end of the world, and the beginning of a new one, all at the same time. The final chord had been struck, but the sound didn't just disappear. It seemed to hang in the smoky air of the hall, vibrating against the walls and the ceiling, ringing in the ears of everyone present. For 3 long seconds, nobody moved. It was a heavy, thick silence, the kind that feels like it has weight. The boy sat with his hands hovering over the keys, his chest rising and falling fast. He was sweating, his face flushed red from the effort. He looked exhausted, like he had just run a mile uphill. Then, the spell broke. It didn't start slowly. It happened all at once, like a dam bursting. A man in the front row let out a loud, breathless whoa. That seemed to wake everyone else up. Suddenly, the room erupted. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was a roar. It was a chaotic mix of shouting, whistling, and stomping feet. The sound was so loud it shook the floorboards. The men jumped to their feet, knocking their chairs over in their haste to stand. They didn't care about their drinks or their cards anymore. All they cared about was the small boy sitting on the piano bench. The noise was overwhelming. It was a release of all the tension that had built up during the performance. The men were screaming words like "yeah" and "go" and "amazing." Some of them were just clapping their hands together so hard it looked like it hurt. Their faces were transformed. The cynicism and boredom were gone. In their place was pure, unfiltered joy. They looked like children themselves, their eyes wide and bright. The boy on the bench looked startled. He pulled his hands back to his lap and looked out at the crowd for the first time. He seemed confused by the reaction. For him, he had just played a song. He didn't understand that he had just changed the atmosphere of the entire room. He looked a little shy, maybe even a bit scared by the wall of noise coming at him. He shrugged his shoulders slightly, a modest gesture that just made the crowd scream louder. Then, something incredible happened. The men, these big, tough, grown men, started rushing toward the stage. They didn't want to hurt him, they wanted to be close to him. They wanted to see the hands that had made that music. The bartender climbed over the bar, leaving his rag behind. The card players abandoned their game. The big guy with the tattoos pushed his way to the front, not to push anyone aside, but just to get a better look. They gathered around the piano, looking at the boy with a kind of reverence. It wasn't the way you look at a kid, it was the way you look at a hero, or a god. They treated him with a respect that was usually reserved for presidents or war generals. A few of them reached out to pat him on the shoulder or shake his hand, but they were surprisingly gentle. They handled him like he was made of glass. One older man, a piano player who had been watching from the side, walked up to the stage. He had tears streaming down his face, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. He reached out and grabbed the boy's hand, shaking it up and down. He didn't say anything at first. He just shook his head and smiled. Then he shouted over the noise, "You got it, kid. You really got it?" The boy just smiled back, a small, nervous smile, but he seemed happy. The contrast was striking. There was the boy, small, young, and innocent, sitting high up on the bench. And there were the men, big, rough, and world-weary, looking up at him with their mouths open. It was a complete reversal of the natural order. Usually, adults look down on children. But tonight, the adults were looking up to the child. They were acknowledging that he possessed something they didn't. He had a gift that couldn't be taught, a spark that couldn't be manufactured. The applause went on for a long time. It must have lasted 5 minutes, maybe 10. Every time it started to die down, someone would shout "Bravo!" or play another one. And the noise would start up again, louder than before. The room felt different now. It wasn't just a smoky social hall anymore. It was a special place. It was a place where history had been made. The air felt cleaner, lighter. The mood had shifted from rough and rowdy to something like a celebration. Eventually, the boy stood up. He slid off the bench, and his feet finally touched the floor. He looked even smaller standing up. He smoothed down his oversized suit jacket. A few men reached out to help him down the steps from the stage, treating him like royalty. He walked through the crowd, and the men parted like the Red Sea to let him pass. They wanted to touch his shoulder as he went by, just to say they were near him. As he walked away from the piano, the boy's demeanor changed again. The genius musician who commanded the room slowly faded away, and the 10-year-old kid came back. He looked around for someone he knew, perhaps his parents or a guardian. He looked a little overwhelmed by all the attention. He rubbed his nose with the back of his hand, a childish gesture that made the men laugh with affection. The bartender finally went back behind the bar and poured a round of drinks for the house, on the house. The men were buzzing with excitement. They were talking at a mile a minute, reliving every moment of the performance. "Did you see that left hand?" one man asked. "I've never heard anything like that," said another. They were arguing about what song he played, trying to describe the sound to those who might have missed it. They knew they had seen something rare. They knew they would remember this night for the rest of their lives. The story of the night isn't just about the music. It's about the power of talent to break down barriers. It doesn't matter if you are old or young, rich or poor. When true greatness stands in front of you, you have to respect it. The men in that hall learned a lesson that night. They learned that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. They learned that a kid in a big suit can have the soul of an artist. When the boy finally left the hall, maybe holding his father's hand, the noise level didn't go back to the way it was before. The rowdiness was gone. Instead, there was a quiet buzz of satisfaction. The men went back to their drinks, but the mood was peaceful. They were content. They had seen something that made them believe in magic again. The piano sat alone in the corner again, silent and dark. But it wasn't just a piece of furniture anymore. To the men in that room, it was a shrine. It was the place where the miracle happened. And the memory of that night, of the kid who made the grown men freeze and then cheer until their throats hurt, would stay with them forever. It was a true story of a moment in time where everything else in the world disappeared, and all that mattered was the music.